The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the manila envelope. I stared at my name written in Richard's familiar handwriting, Victoria Ashford, and felt something strange settle in my chest. Not heartbreak, which I'd expected. Not rage, which I'd prepared for. Instead, I felt a peculiar sense of clarity, as if someone had just handed me a roadmap to a destination I hadn't known I wanted to reach. Richard had left me for Natalie Chen, his 26-year-old assistant at the law firm. The affair had been going on for 8 months before I discovered it, and even then, I'd only found out because Natalie had called our house by mistake, thinking she was dialing Richard's cell phone. The conversation that followed, her stammered apologies, my cold questions, and eventually her tearful confession, had been surreal in its awkwardness. "Mrs. Ashford, I never meant for this to happen," she'd said, her voice shaking through the phone. "I know how this looks, and I know what you must think of me." What I thought of her was complicated. Natalie wasn't the stereotypical other woman I'd imagined during the long nights when I'd suspected something was wrong. She wasn't calculating or manipulative. She was brilliant. Richard had mentioned her academic achievements from Stanford Law countless times, but also naive in a way that only someone who'd never been married could be. She genuinely believed that what she and Richard had was love, not a midlife crisis disguised as romance. Now, 6 months after that phone call, and 3 months after Richard moved out of our Beacon Hill townhouse, I was holding divorce papers that would officially end 18 years of marriage. The financial settlement was generous. Richard was nothing if not fair in his business dealings, but what struck me most was the custody arrangement for our 16-year-old daughter, Emma. Joint custody, with Emma spending weekdays with me and weekends with Richard. "At least he's not trying to take Emma away from you," my sister Caroline had said when I called her with the news. That's something, but I knew Richard better than that. He wasn't fighting for more custody because he didn't actually want the responsibility of daily parenting. Weekend visits were exciting and manageable. Handling teenage mood swings, homework supervision, and college preparation required a level of consistent engagement that Richard had never been comfortable with, even when we were married. Emma took the news with the kind of resigned maturity that broke my heart. She was sitting at our kitchen island, supposedly doing calculus homework but actually scrolling through social media, when I showed her the papers. "So it's official now?" she asked without looking up from her phone. "It will be, once we sign everything and it goes through the court." She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "Are you okay, Mom?" The question surprised me with its directness. Emma had been carefully neutral throughout the separation, refusing to take sides or express opinions about her father's choices. But now she was looking at me with genuine concern, and I realized she'd been protecting my feelings even while processing her own complicated emotions about her family falling apart. "I'm okay," I said, and was surprised to discover it was true. "Actually, I think I might be more than okay." "What do you mean?" I sat down next to her, setting the divorce papers aside. I think this might be the beginning of something better, not just the end of something that wasn't working." Emma studied my face with the kind of intensity that reminded me she was Richard's daughter, as well as mine. She had his analytical mind, though thankfully not his tendency toward emotional compartmentalization. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better?" "I'm not just saying that to make either of us feel better." Over the following weeks, as I worked with my attorney to finalize the divorce details, I found myself thinking constantly about what came next. At 42, I was financially secure, professionally accomplished in a past life, and completely uncertain about how to rebuild my identity as a single woman. I'd been Victoria Ashford, wife of Richard Ashford, for so long that I'd almost forgotten who Victoria had been before the marriage. I'd been an art history professor at Boston University before Emma was born, specializing in contemporary American sculpture. I'd loved the research, the teaching, and the intellectual challenge of helping students understand how artistic expression reflected broader cultural movements. But when Emma arrived, Richard and I had agreed that I would take a leave of absence that had somehow stretched into 16 years. Now, with Emma approaching her senior year of high school and preparing for college, I found myself wondering if it was too late to return to academia. The art world had evolved significantly since I'd stepped away, and my professional network had largely disappeared. But the intellectual curiosity that had driven me to pursue a PhD in the first place was still there, waiting to be re-engaged. I was researching contemporary art programs and trying to determine whether my credentials were still relevant when I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was immediately familiar. "Mrs. Ashford? This is Natalie Chen. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you." I set down my laptop and walked to the window, overlooking our small garden. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, and I found myself focusing on the colors rather than the complexity of this conversation. "Hello, Natalie. This is unexpected. I know. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but I have something I need to tell you, and I thought you should hear it from me rather than finding out some other way." The pause that followed was loaded with possibility. I could hang up, I could be cold and dismissive, or I could listen to whatever had prompted her to make this call. My curiosity won. "I'm listening. Richard and I broke up 3 weeks ago." I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. Whatever I'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "I see. I know this probably sounds strange, but I wanted you to know because I also wanted to apologize. Not just for the affair, but for being so naive about what it meant. I thought I understood what I was getting into, but I didn't understand anything." Her voice carried a quality I hadn't heard during our previous conversations, a kind of hard-won maturity that suggested she'd learned some difficult lessons recently. "What happened?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. I realized that the man who would cheat on his wife of 18 years would also cheat on his girlfriend of 8 months. It took me embarrassingly long to figure that out. I found myself sitting down, not because the news was devastating, but because it was so predictable that it felt almost anticlimactic. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Are you?" The question was direct but not accusatory. "Because I wouldn't blame you if you weren't." I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry that Natalie had been hurt? Yes, I realized I actually was. She was young and had made foolish choices, but she wasn't malicious. She'd been a weapon in Richard's midlife crisis, but she hadn't volunteered for that role knowingly. "I am sorry," I said finally. "Heartbreak is terrible regardless of the circumstances that lead to it. Thank you for saying that. I know I don't deserve your kindness." Everyone deserves kindness, Natalie. The question is what you do with it. Another pause, this one more contemplative than awkward. "Mrs. Ashford, can I ask you something?" "Victoria." "And yes, how did you get over it?" "The betrayal, I mean. How did you move past feeling like an idiot for not seeing it coming?" The question revealed more about Natalie's current emotional state than anything she'd said directly. She wasn't just dealing with heartbreak. She was dealing with the humiliation of realizing she'd been exactly as naive as everyone probably thought she was. "I don't think you ever completely get over feeling foolish about being deceived," I said carefully. "But you can choose to let that feeling teach you something rather than define you. What did it teach you?" I looked out at the garden again, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder I'd installed after Richard moved out. It taught me that I'd been living someone else's life for so long that I'd forgotten what my own life looked like. The betrayal was painful, but the awakening was worth it. "I don't understand. I spent 18 years being Richard's wife and Emma's mother, which are both important roles. But I'd stopped being Victoria. I'd stopped pursuing my own interests, developing my own goals, or even knowing what I wanted beyond maintaining the family structure. When that structure collapsed, I discovered that I was still there underneath it all." Natalie was quiet for so long that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke again. "I think I gave up my own life too, but I'd barely started it. I went straight from college to law school to working for Richard. I don't even know who I am outside of being someone's assistant or someone's girlfriend." "That's actually an advantage," I said. "You have time to figure it out without having to untangle decades of other people's expectations." "It doesn't feel like an advantage." "No, I imagine it doesn't. But trust me, starting over at 26 is easier than starting over at 42. We talked for another 20 minutes, the conversation evolving from awkward to surprisingly honest. Natalie was clearly intelligent and reflective, qualities that had probably attracted Richard initially, but had also enabled her to recognize the relationship's fundamental problems once the initial excitement wore off. When we hung up, I found myself thinking not about Richard or the affair, but about Natalie's question. How do you move past feeling like an idiot? The answer, I realized, was that you stop trying to avoid making mistakes and start trying to make better ones. 3 days later, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Boston University's art history department and scheduled a meeting with the current department chair. I decided to explore returning to academia, but I wanted to understand realistically what that would require after such a long absence. Professor Margaret Winters had been a graduate student when I was finishing my dissertation, and she greeted me with warmth tempered by curiosity about my long absence from the field. "Victoria, it's wonderful to see you. I've always wondered what happened to your research on public sculpture and community identity. That was groundbreaking work." We spent an hour discussing changes in the field, new research methodologies, and the current academic job market. The conversation was both encouraging and sobering. My previous work was still relevant, but I'd need to demonstrate current engagement with contemporary developments in art history and cultural studies. "Have you considered starting with guest lectures or adjunct positions?" Professor Winters suggested. "It would give you a chance to reconnect with the academic community while you develop new research." "I've thought about it, but I'm not sure I'm ready for the uncertainty of adjunct work. I need something more stable while I'm rebuilding my professional identity." "What about museum work?" The Museum of Fine Arts has been expanding their contemporary collections, and they're always looking for people with strong academic backgrounds who can bridge the gap between scholarship and public engagement. The suggestion intrigued me. Museum work would allow me to stay connected to art history while developing different professional skills. And it would provide the stability I needed while Emma finished high school. That evening, as I was researching museum positions and trying to update my sadly outdated CV, Emma wandered into my home office with a cup of tea, and that look that meant she wanted to have a serious conversation. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you really okay with starting over? Like, actually okay, not just putting on a brave face, okay?" I saved my document and turned to face her fully. Emma deserved honest answers, especially about changes that would affect her life too. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared that I'm too old to restart my career, scared that I've been away from my field too long, scared that I don't know how to be single after being married for so long. But I'm also excited in a way I haven't been in years." "Excited about what?" "About finding out who I am when I'm not trying to be who I think other people need me to be." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Is that what you were doing? Being who you thought Dad needed you to be?" "Not just Dad. You too, and our extended family, and the other parents at your school." I got so focused on playing all these roles that I lost track of what I actually wanted. "What do you want now?" It was such a simple question, but I realized it had been years since anyone had asked me what I wanted rather than what I thought was best for everyone else. "I want to feel intellectually challenged again. I want to contribute something meaningful to conversations about art and culture. I want to model for you what it looks like to pursue your own goals instead of just supporting other people's." "That sounds pretty awesome, actually." "You think so?" "Yeah. I mean, I love that you've always been there for me, but sometimes I worried about what would happen to you when I went to college. Now it sounds like you'll have your own adventures to focus on." Her acceptance meant more to me than I'd expected. Emma's support felt like permission to stop being afraid of disappointing people and start being excited about possibilities. The next morning, I was reviewing museum job postings when my phone rang again. Natalie's name appeared on the caller ID, and I found myself answering without hesitation. "Hi, Natalie. Victoria, I hope it's okay that I'm calling again. I have a strange question for you." "I'm getting used to strange conversations lately. What's your question?" "Are you looking for an assistant?" I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" I know how that sounds, believe me. But I've been thinking about our conversation, and about what you said about starting over and finding out who you are. I quit my job at Richard's firm yesterday. "Oh my God, Natalie?" I know it was probably stupid, but I couldn't keep working there. Every day I was reminded of how naive I'd been, and I felt like everyone was either judging me or pitying me. I needed to make a clean break. That's understandable, but why are you asking about working for me? Because you're the only person who's treated me like a human being instead of a cautionary tale. And because I heard through the grapevine that you're exploring getting back into academia or museum work. I was quiet, processing the surreal nature of this offer. The woman who had been sleeping with my husband wanted to work for me. I know it's crazy, Natalie continued, but I'm good at research, I'm organized. I understand legal documents and contracts, and I need to work for someone I respect. You're starting over professionally, and I'm starting over personally. Maybe we could help each other. Natalie, I don't know what to say. You don't have to decide now. But would you at least think about it? Maybe we could meet for coffee and talk about what kind of help you might need. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at nothing for a long time. The offer was absurd, potentially complicated, and exactly the kind of unconventional solution that my old self would have rejected immediately. But my old self had been married to a man who left her for his assistant. Maybe my new self was brave enough to hire that same assistant and turn a painful ending into an interesting beginning. That afternoon, I called my sister Caroline to get her reaction to Natalie's offer. She wants to do what? Caroline's voice went up an octave. Work as my assistant while I rebuild my career. Victoria, that's insane. You can't hire your ex-husband's mistress. Why not? Because, I don't know why not, but there must be a reason. The only reason I can think of is that people might think it's strange. But people already think my situation is strange. At least this way, I'm making it strange on my own terms. What does Emma think about this? I hadn't asked Emma yet, but I had a feeling she'd be more open to the idea than most adults would be. Teenagers were often more adaptable to unconventional situations than people who'd spent decades learning what was quote. I'll talk to her tonight. But Caroline, what if this actually makes sense? Natalie is overqualified to be an assistant, which means she could probably help with research and project management. She's looking for a fresh start, and I need support as I rebuild my professional life. It's practical. It's also potentially explosive. What happens when you disagree about something? What happens when Emma doesn't like her? What happens when people find out? These were all valid concerns, but they were also the kinds of worries that had kept me playing it safe for years. Maybe it was time to stop managing everyone else's potential reactions and start focusing on what might actually work. What happens if it works out better than anyone expects? I countered. Caroline sighed. I can't believe I'm saying this, but maybe you should at least meet with her. See if you can have a professional conversation without it being weird. That evening, Emma and I had pizza for dinner while I explained Natalie's unexpected job offer. Emma listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for particularly challenging math problems. So she wants to work for you, Emma said finally. She wants to work with me, I think. Help me with research and administrative tasks while I figure out my next career move. And you're considering it. I'm considering it. Emma took another bite of pizza, chewing thoughtfully. Can I ask you something without it sounding judgmental? Yes. Why her? I mean, there must be other people who could help you with work stuff. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. Honestly, because she's the first person who's offered, and because I think we might understand each other in a way that other people wouldn't. What do you mean? We've both had our lives disrupted by the same person's choices. We've both learned some hard lessons about trusting the wrong people, and we're both trying to figure out who we are when we're not defined by our relationship to Richard. Emma nodded slowly. That actually makes sense. But what if Dad finds out and gets weird about it? Then he gets weird about it. His reaction is his responsibility, not mine. Okay, I think you should meet with her. Really? Yeah. If nothing else, it'll make for interesting dinner conversations. 2 days later, I met Natalie at a coffee shop in Cambridge, deliberately choosing neutral territory for what was sure to be an unusual conversation. She arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio and looking more professional than I'd ever seen her. Thank you for agreeing to meet, she said as we settled into a corner table. I know this is an unconventional situation. That might be an understatement. She smiled ruefully. Fair enough. Let me start by being completely transparent about why I think this could work. For the next hour, Natalie outlined her qualifications, her research skills, and her understanding of what I might need as I re-entered the professional world. She'd clearly done her homework, researching museum positions, academic requirements, and grant opportunities in art history. I also think, she said carefully, that we might be able to help each other navigate the psychological aspects of starting over. We've both had our confidence shaken by Richard's choices. We both need to rebuild our professional identities. And we both understand what it's like to realize you've been living according to someone else's script. What makes you think you understand what that's like for me? Because I spent 8 months trying to be the woman Richard wanted me to be instead of figuring out who I actually was. I changed the way I dressed, the places I went, even the way I talked about my career goals. I made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. I'd done the same thing during my marriage, gradually adjusting my interests and ambitions to accommodate Richard's needs and preferences, until I'd almost forgotten what my original goals had been. If we did this, I said slowly, it couldn't be about Richard. It would have to be about our work and our professional goals. The past would have to stay in the past. I understand completely. This would be about moving forward, not looking backward. And we'd have to establish clear boundaries. Professional relationship only, with specific expectations and regular check-ins about how it's working. Absolutely. I studied her face, trying to assess whether she truly understood what she was proposing. Working together would require both of us to rise above the circumstances that had brought us into each other's lives and focus on building something positive and productive. Natalie, why do you really want to do this? She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of honesty that only comes from serious self-reflection. Because you're the first person I've met who's turned a terrible situation into an opportunity for growth, instead of just surviving it or seeking revenge. I want to learn how to do that. And because I think helping you succeed might be the best way for me to make amends for the pain I caused. I'm not looking for atonement. I know, but I am. That afternoon I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I offered Natalie a 3-month trial position as my research assistant, with clearly defined responsibilities, and the understanding that either of us could end the arrangement if it wasn't working. Are you sure about this? She asked, looking both excited and terrified. I'm not sure about anything anymore, I replied. But I'm learning that uncertainty isn't the same thing as impossibility. The next week, Natalie started working from my home office 3 days a week, helping me research museum positions, update my academic credentials, and develop a strategy for re-entering the art history field. The arrangement was strange at first, but it was also surprisingly productive. Natalie brought skills I hadn't expected. She was excellent at legal research, which proved useful for understanding museum employment contracts and grant requirements. She had a talent for organizing complex information, which helped me synthesize years of developments in contemporary art theory. And she asked thoughtful questions that pushed me to articulate my goals more clearly than I'd been able to do on my own. What specifically interests you about the intersection of public art and community identity? She asked, during our second week working together. Because that seems to be a recurring theme in your previous research, but I want to make sure I understand how you want to develop it further. The question forced me to think critically about my academic interests in a way I hadn't done in years. As I explained my theories about how public sculpture reflected and shaped community values, I realized I'd missed this kind of intellectual engagement more than I'd admitted to myself. That's fascinating, Natalie said when I finished. Have you seen the recent work on digital art installations and social media engagement? There might be some interesting parallels to explore. She was right, and her suggestion opened up research directions I hadn't considered. This was exactly the kind of collaborative thinking I'd been missing during my years away from academia. Emma's initial wariness about the arrangement gradually gave way to curiosity and then acceptance. She'd come home from school to find Natalie and me deep in discussion about contemporary art movements or museum exhibition strategies, and she began joining our conversations. Mom's way more excited about this stuff than she's been about anything in years, Emma told Natalie one afternoon. It's cool to see her being so intellectual again. Your mother is brilliant, Natalie replied. She just needed an excuse to let that brilliance out again. After 6 weeks of working together, I received a call from the Museum of Fine Arts. They'd received my application for a position as curator of contemporary collections, and they wanted to schedule an interview. The opportunity was exactly what I'd been hoping for, a chance to work with cutting-edge artists while helping the public engage with contemporary art. "This is incredible," Natalie said when I told her about the interview. "Do you feel prepared?" "I feel more prepared than I would have without your help," I admitted. "The research you've done on current trends and exhibition strategies has been invaluable. What can we do to make sure you're ready?" We spent the next week conducting mock interviews, reviewing recent exhibitions, and developing talking points about my vision for contemporary art curation. Natalie's questions were insightful and challenging, pushing me to think strategically about how my academic background could translate into museum work. The day of my interview, I felt more confident than I had in years. I could articulate my ideas clearly, I was current on developments in the field, and I had specific proposals for engaging new audiences with contemporary art. The interview panel seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives, and I left feeling cautiously optimistic. 2 weeks later, I got the job. "You did it," Natalie said when I called to tell her the news. "I'm so proud of you." "We did it," I corrected. "I couldn't have been ready for this opportunity without your support." That evening, Emma and I celebrated with champagne, for me, and sparkling cider, for her, and I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. I'd gone from being a displaced housewife to having a meaningful career opportunity, and I'd done it with help from the most unlikely ally imaginable. "Mom," Emma said as we sat in the living room, "I have to tell you something." "What's that?" "I think hiring Natalie was the smartest thing you've done since the divorce." "Really?" "Yeah. I mean, it was weird at first, but watching you two work together has been amazing. You're both so much more confident than when you started, and you've helped each other become better versions of yourselves." She was right. Over the past 2 months, I'd watched Natalie develop from a young woman defined by poor choices into someone with clear professional goals and genuine self-awareness. And I'd rediscovered my own intellectual capabilities and professional ambitions. "What's going to happen when your 3-month trial is up?" Emma asked. It was a good question. The trial period had been intended to see if we could work together without the baggage of our shared history interfering with our professional relationship. But somewhere along the way, our collaboration had evolved into something more substantial than either of us had initially envisioned. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think we've both proven that we can choose to define our relationship by what we're building together rather than what brought us together in the first place." The next day, I had a conversation with Natalie about extending our working arrangement. My new position at the museum would require significant research support, and she'd proven herself invaluable in that role. "I'd love to continue working with you," she said, "but I want to make sure this is what you really want, not just what's convenient." "Natalie, 3 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be offering you a permanent position as my research assistant, I'd have thought they were insane. But you've become an essential part of my professional life, and I can't imagine rebuilding my career without your support." Even though people might think it's strange? Especially because people think it's strange. We've proven that it's possible to transform a painful situation into something positive and productive. That's not strange. That's extraordinary. 6 months later, I was settled into my role at the Museum of Fine Arts, working on a groundbreaking exhibition about public art and community identity. Natalie had enrolled in a graduate program in arts administration while continuing to work as my research coordinator, pursuing her own professional development while supporting mine. The exhibition opened to critical acclaim and record attendance. The centerpiece was an interactive installation that allowed visitors to explore how different communities had used public art to express their values and aspirations. The project perfectly captured the themes I'd been developing throughout my career, and it felt like a triumphant return to the art world. At the opening reception, I was surrounded by colleagues, critics, and community leaders who were enthusiastic about the exhibition's innovative approach to contemporary art. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Emma, now a senior in high school, brought her boyfriend to see the exhibition. "My mom curated this whole thing," I heard her tell him with obvious pride. She's basically a genius. Later that evening, as Natalie and I were reviewing feedback from visitors and planning follow-up programs, she looked up from her notes with a thoughtful expression. "Victoria, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret how all this started? The affair, the divorce, all the pain that had to happen before we got to this point?" I considered the question seriously. The betrayal had been genuinely painful, and there had been many nights when I'd wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. But that pain had also been the catalyst for changes that had ultimately made my life richer and more meaningful than it had been in years. "I regret the pain," I said finally. "But I don't regret where it led. I'm more myself now than I've been in decades, and I have work that genuinely matters to me. I couldn't have gotten here without going through what I went through. Even the part about hiring me, especially the part about hiring you. You've become one of the most important collaborators of my career, and one of the most unlikely friendships of my life." It was true. What had started as a strange professional arrangement had evolved into genuine mutual respect and affection. Natalie had grown from the naive young woman who'd called to confess her affair into a thoughtful, capable professional who challenged me intellectually and supported me personally. "I never thanked you properly," Natalie said quietly. "For what? For seeing who I could become, instead of just who I had been. For giving me the chance to be part of something meaningful, instead of just trying to survive my mistakes." "You didn't need my permission to become who you were meant to be," I replied. "You just needed the opportunity to show yourself what you were capable of." 2 years later, I was invited to speak at a conference on innovative approaches to museum curation. During my presentation, I talked about the importance of transforming unexpected circumstances into opportunities for growth and collaboration. Sometimes the most productive partnerships come from the most unlikely places, I told the audience. The key is being willing to look beyond the circumstances that bring people together and focus on what they might be able to build together. After my presentation, a young curator approached me with questions about collaborative research methods and unconventional professional relationships. As I answered her questions, I realized that my story with Natalie had become more than just a personal success. It had become a model for how creative professionals could support each other's growth regardless of how they initially met. That evening I called Emma, now a sophomore at Yale studying psychology and art therapy. "How did the conference go?" she asked. "Really well. I think our story is resonating with people who are trying to rebuild their own careers or navigate complicated professional relationships." "Our story?" "Mine and Natalie's. The idea that you can choose to define your relationships by what you create together, rather than what brought you together in the first place. Mom, I'm really proud of what you two have built together, and I'm proud of who you've become." "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything to me. Can I tell you something funny?" "Always." "My friends at school think it's the coolest thing ever that you hired Dad's ex-girlfriend and turned her into your business partner. They think you're like a feminist superhero or something." I laughed, remembering how terrified I'd been of people's reactions when I first considered Natalie's offer. "What do you think?" "I think you're just Mom, but the version of Mom who remembered that she's allowed to make her own choices and define her own success." After we hung up, I sat in my home office, the same room where Natalie and I had first started working together, and reflected on how much had changed since Richard left. I'd rebuilt my career, developed meaningful work, and created a partnership that had surprised everyone, including myself. The woman who had been abandoned for a younger assistant had hired that same assistant and helped her become a respected professional in her own right. The marriage that had ended in betrayal had led to a friendship built on mutual respect and shared ambition. Richard had thought he was writing the end of my story when he left me for Natalie. Instead, he'd provided the opening chapter for something neither Natalie nor I could have imagined. A story about transformation, collaboration, and the power of choosing to build something positive from the most unlikely circumstances. The assistant who had once threatened my marriage had become the colleague who helped me rediscover my professional purpose. And in doing so, we'd both learned that the most meaningful success comes not from defeating someone else, but from helping each other become the best versions of ourselves. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I smiled thinking about tomorrow's meetings, upcoming exhibitions, and the continued evolution of a partnership that had begun in betrayal and grown into something beautiful. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting better. And sometimes getting better means extending grace to the very person who helped you discover how strong you really were. 3 years into our professional partnership, Natalie and I received an invitation that would test everything we'd built together. The Getty Center in Los Angeles wanted us to collaborate on their most ambitious exhibition to date, Transformation and Identity: How Crisis Shapes Community Art. The project would require us to spend 6 months in California, working with artists, community leaders, and cultural institutions across the state. "This is incredible," Natalie said as we reviewed the proposal in my office. "They specifically requested both of us. They want our perspective on how personal transformation influences artistic expression." I studied the detailed project outline, noting the complexity and prestige of what they were proposing. The Getty wanted us to curate an exhibition that would travel to major museums across the country, potentially reaching millions of visitors. It was the kind of career-defining opportunity that most curators could only dream of. "It would mean relocating to Los Angeles for half a year," I said, thinking through the logistics. "Emma's in her junior year at Yale, so she'd be fine. But this would be a major commitment. Are you worried about working so closely together for such an extended period?" It was a fair question. Our Boston-based collaboration had been successful, partly because we each maintained separate personal lives and could step away from work when needed. 6 months of intensive collaboration in a new city would be a different kind of test. "I'm not worried about our professional relationship," I said carefully. "But I am wondering how this might affect our personal dynamics. We've never spent extended time together outside of Boston." Natalie nodded thoughtfully. "What if we establish some ground rules? Separate living arrangements, defined work hours, scheduled time apart. We could treat it like any other professional collaboration." "Except it's not like any other professional collaboration, is it?" "No," she admitted. "But maybe that's why we're so good at it." That evening, I called Emma to get her perspective on the opportunity. At 20, she had developed a sophisticated understanding of professional relationships and personal boundaries, and I valued her insights about major career decisions. "Mom, this sounds amazing," she said after I explained the Getty project. "But can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you hesitating because of the work, or because you're worried about what people might think about you and Natalie spending so much time together?" The question cut straight to the heart of my concerns. Despite our success in Boston, I was still occasionally self-conscious about our unconventional partnership. The art world could be surprisingly gossipy, and I didn't want speculation about our relationship to overshadow our professional work. Both, honestly. The work itself sounds incredible, but yes, I'm concerned about how the extended collaboration might be perceived. "Mom, you've spent 3 years proving that you and Natalie can create something meaningful together. Why would you let other people's potential opinions stop you from taking the next step?" She was right, of course. Emma had watched our partnership evolve from an awkward arrangement into genuine professional respect and personal friendship. If anyone understood the authenticity of our working relationship, it was her. "Besides," Emma continued, "didn't you tell me that the best opportunities often come disguised as complications?" I had to smile. Emma was quoting my own advice back to me, something she'd been doing since middle school whenever she thought I was overthinking a situation. "You think I should say yes? I think you should stop worrying about what other people might think and start focusing on what you and Natalie might create together. This exhibition sounds like it could influence how museums approach community art for decades." 2 days later, Natalie and I accepted the Getty's offer. The next 4 months were a whirlwind of planning, research, and preparation. We developed a framework for exploring how personal and collective trauma had influenced artistic expression in different California communities, from post-earthquake San Francisco to immigrant neighborhoods in Los Angeles to agricultural communities dealing with economic disruption. Our approach was innovative and ambitious. Rather than simply displaying existing artworks, we wanted to create spaces where visitors could understand the relationship between artistic creation and community healing. The exhibition would include interactive elements, artist residencies, and community workshops that allowed people to engage directly with the themes we were exploring. We're not just curating art, Natalie observed during one of our planning sessions. We're curating experiences that help people understand their own capacity for transformation. Exactly. Art isn't just about aesthetic appreciation. It's about recognizing the human impulse to create meaning from difficulty. The depth of our collaboration had evolved significantly since our early days working together. Natalie had developed sophisticated insights about contemporary art theory, while I'd learned to appreciate her perspective on legal and administrative aspects of large-scale exhibitions. We'd become intellectual partners in ways that neither of us had initially anticipated. When we arrived in Los Angeles, we established separate apartments in the same building, maintaining independence while facilitating collaboration. The arrangement worked well, allowing us to maintain professional boundaries while sharing the intensive work of developing the exhibition. Our first major challenge came when we began working with artists from East Los Angeles, many of whom had used their work to process experiences of immigration, economic displacement, and cultural adaptation. The community was initially skeptical of two outsiders, particularly two women with our complicated history, coming in to interpret their experiences for a major museum. "Why should we trust you to tell our stories?" asked Maria Santos, a muralist whose work documented 3 generations of her family's experience in Los Angeles. "What do you know about using art to survive?" It was a fair and important question. Natalie and I looked at each other, recognizing that our standard academic credentials wouldn't be sufficient to earn the trust of artists who had used their work to navigate genuine hardship. "You're right to be skeptical," I said finally. "We can't claim to understand your specific experiences, but we can share our own experience of using creativity and collaboration to transform something painful into something productive." I told Maria about the divorce, the affair, and the unexpected partnership that had emerged from those circumstances. Natalie added her perspective on learning to move beyond shame and guilt toward purposeful work. We explained how our collaboration had taught us about the possibility of creating beauty and meaning from the most unlikely circumstances. "So you're saying this exhibition is personal for you," Maria said when we finished. "Everything meaningful is personal," Natalie replied. "The question is whether you can translate personal experience into something that serves a larger purpose." Maria studied us for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay. Let's see what you can do." Over the following weeks, we worked closely with Maria and other community artists to understand how their work reflected broader themes of resilience and transformation. The process was challenging and educational, pushing us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual healing and collective identity. "Art saved my life," explained David Kim, a photographer who documented the rebuilding of Koreatown after the 1992 riots. "But it also helped save my community." When you create beauty in the aftermath of destruction, you're making a statement about what's possible. These conversations informed every aspect of our exhibition design. We created spaces that honored both individual artistic vision and collective cultural expression, showing how personal transformation and community healing often happen simultaneously. Natalie proved particularly skilled at working with younger artists who were using digital media and social platforms to explore identity and belonging. Her generation's familiarity with online communities helped her understand how contemporary artists were expanding traditional definitions of public art. "They're creating virtual murals," she explained to me after spending a day with a group of college-age artists, using Instagram and TikTok to reach audiences that would never set foot in a traditional gallery. It's fascinating how they're adapting traditional community art practices for digital spaces. These insights led us to incorporate digital components into the exhibition, creating online spaces where visitors could continue exploring themes of transformation and identity after leaving the museum. The approach was groundbreaking for the Getty, and it attracted attention from curators around the world. 4 months into our Los Angeles residency, we received unexpected news that tested our partnership in ways we hadn't anticipated. Richard was getting married to his new girlfriend, a corporate attorney he'd met at a legal conference, and the wedding was being planned for the same weekend as our exhibition opening. "I can't believe his timing," Emma said when she called to tell me about the wedding invitation. "It's like he's trying to upstage your big moment." I found myself less upset by the news than I would have expected. Richard's remarriage felt like the final closing of a chapter that had already ended in my mind. But I was concerned about how the timing might affect Natalie, who still carried some guilt about the role she'd played in ending my marriage. "How are you feeling about this?" I asked her when I shared the news. "Honestly? Relieved," she said, surprising me. "It confirms that what Richard and I had wasn't special or meaningful. He was just looking for someone to fill a role in his life, and when I couldn't do that anymore, he found someone else who could." "And that doesn't hurt?" "Not the way I thought it would. I think I've finally understood the difference between being chosen for who you are and being chosen for what you represent." Her insight was profound and showed how much she'd grown since our early conversations about heartbreak and humiliation. The young woman who had once defined herself through her relationship with Richard had developed into someone with clear professional identity and personal values. The exhibition opening was a triumph beyond anything either of us had imagined. The Getty's main galleries were transformed into spaces that told powerful stories about human resilience and creative expression. Visitors moved through installations that showed how individuals and communities had used art to process trauma, celebrate identity, and imagine new possibilities. The centerpiece was a collaborative mural created by artists from different Los Angeles communities, showing how diverse experiences of transformation could create something beautiful when brought together. The piece perfectly captured the exhibition's central theme, that healing and growth were both individual and collective processes. "This is extraordinary," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Getty's chief curator, as she toured the exhibition with us. "You've created something that's simultaneously scholarly and deeply moving." The response has been overwhelming. The opening reception drew artists, scholars, community leaders, and museum professionals from around the world. Conversations were intense and meaningful, with visitors sharing their own stories of transformation and discussing how art had helped them navigate difficult periods in their lives. But the moment that meant the most to me came when Maria Santos, the muralist who had initially been skeptical of our project, approached Natalie and me near the end of the evening. "I need to thank you," she said. "This exhibition has given our work a platform and a context that we never could have achieved on our own. But more than that, you've shown how people can take the worst things that happen to them and use them to create something that serves others." "That's what you've been doing with your art for years," I replied. "Yes, but I didn't always understand it that way. Seeing our work in this context, surrounded by stories from other communities, has helped me understand that what we do is part of something larger. We're all engaged in the same essential work of transformation." 3 weeks after the exhibition opened, we received news that it would be extended for an additional 3 months due to popular demand, and that the traveling version had been booked by museums in 12 major cities. The success exceeded our most optimistic projections and established both of us as leading voices in contemporary museum curation. But the real measure of our success came in the form of smaller, more personal responses. Community colleges started offering courses based on the exhibition's framework. Social workers began using our materials to help clients understand the healing potential of creative expression. Art therapists incorporated our research into their practice with trauma survivors. "We've created something that's actually useful," Natalie observed as we reviewed feedback from educators and healthcare professionals. "Not just beautiful or intellectually interesting, but genuinely helpful to people who are trying to rebuild their lives." "That's what happens when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to serve them," I replied. Our success brought new opportunities and challenges. We were invited to consult on major exhibitions around the world, to write a book about our methodology, and to establish a research institute focused on community-based curatorial practice. Each opportunity was exciting, but they also raised questions about how to maintain the personal connection and cultural sensitivity that had made our work meaningful. "I don't want to become so successful that we lose touch with what made us effective in the first place," Natalie said as we discussed whether to accept an offer to curate a major international exhibition on trauma and art. "What do you think made us effective?" "Honesty about our own experiences, willingness to be vulnerable with the artists and communities we work with, recognition that we're not experts on other people's pain, just collaborators in exploring how creativity can transform it." Her analysis was exactly right. Our success had come not from academic credentials or institutional authority, but from authentic engagement with themes that we understood personally. As our professional profile grew, we needed to be careful not to lose that authenticity. We decided to establish the Institute for Transformational Art at a mid-sized university that valued community engagement over prestige. The institute would provide resources for artists, curators, and communities interested in exploring the relationship between creativity and healing, while maintaining the personal, collaborative approach that had characterized our best work. We want to create something sustainable, I explained to the university's board of trustees. Not just a monument to our own success, but a resource that will continue generating meaningful work long after we're gone. The institute opened 2 years later, housed in a renovated warehouse that included exhibition spaces, artist studios, community workshops, and research facilities. Our first major project was a collaboration with local social service agencies, creating art programs for people experiencing homelessness, addiction recovery, and domestic violence survival. Natalie developed a particular expertise in working with young people who had aged out of foster care, helping them use artistic expression to process their experiences and envision positive futures. Her work was informed by her own understanding of what it felt like to rebuild your identity after making serious mistakes. "These kids remind me of myself at 26, she told me after facilitating a workshop with former foster youth. "They're carrying so much shame about things that weren't really their fault, and they don't know how to imagine a future that's different from their past." "What do you tell them?" "The same thing you told me, that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, but you have to be willing to do the work." I continued focusing on community-based exhibitions, working with neighborhoods that had experienced economic disruption, environmental disasters, or social upheaval. Each project taught me something new about the universal human capacity for resilience and the specific ways that different communities used creativity to maintain hope. One of our most meaningful projects was an exhibition about climate change and coastal communities, developed in partnership with towns in Louisiana that were dealing with rising sea levels and economic displacement. The project took 3 years to complete and required us to spend extended time in communities that were literally disappearing. "This is heartbreaking," Natalie said after we'd spent a week in a fishing village that would likely be underwater within a decade. "How do you create art about losing your home?" "The same way you create art about losing anything important," I replied. "You honor what was meaningful about it, and you use that honoring to help people imagine what might come next." The resulting exhibition was one of our most powerful, showing how communities facing displacement had used art to preserve cultural memory while adapting to new realities. The project influenced climate policy discussions and helped secure funding for community relocation assistance. By this time, our partnership had been featured in major publications, academic journals, and documentary films. We were frequently invited to speak about collaboration, innovation in museum practice, and the role of personal experience in professional development. But the attention never felt entirely comfortable for either of us. "I still can't quite believe that our story is inspiring to other people," Natalie said after we'd finished a keynote presentation at a major conference on arts administration. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we basically stumbled into this partnership because we'd both made such a mess of our personal lives. It doesn't feel like we deserve credit for turning it into something positive." "Maybe that's exactly why it's inspiring," I suggested. "Most people have made messes of their personal lives at some point. Seeing that it's possible to transform those messes into something meaningful gives them hope for their own situations." 5 years after returning from Los Angeles, Emma graduated from Yale and moved to Boston to start a master's program in art therapy. Her decision to pursue that field had been influenced by watching our work at the Institute, and I was deeply proud of how she'd chosen to apply her interests in psychology and art to helping others. "I want to work with kids who've experienced trauma," she told me when she explained her career plans. "But I also want to understand how creativity can help families heal together, not just individuals." Her perspective reflected something I'd observed in our community work, that healing was rarely just a personal process. Individuals recovered within the context of relationships, families, and communities, and the most effective interventions addressed multiple levels simultaneously. Emma began volunteering at the Institute while completing her graduate studies, bringing fresh insights about family systems and group dynamics to our programming. Having her involved added another dimension to our work and deepened my appreciation for how professional and personal growth could happen simultaneously. "It's fascinating to watch you and Natalie work together," Emma told me one evening after we'd finished a particularly complex community workshop. "You've developed this kind of professional telepathy where you anticipate each other's ideas and build on them seamlessly. That's what happens when you work closely with someone for 7 years, I replied. No, it's more than that. You've both grown into versions of yourselves that you might never have discovered without this partnership. You bring out each other's best qualities. Her observation made me think about how much both Natalie and I had changed since our first awkward coffee shop meeting. The insecure divorcee and the guilt-ridden young woman had evolved into confident professionals who genuinely enjoyed challenging each other intellectually and supporting each other's growth. Natalie had completed her graduate degree in arts administration and was now pursuing a PhD in community development, while I'd been promoted to Director of Community Engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts and had published 2 books about transformational curatorial practice. Our individual accomplishments were significant, but our collaborative work remained the most meaningful aspect of our careers. I've been thinking about something, Natalie said during one of our weekly planning meetings at the Institute. We've been so focused on our work that we've never really talked about what our partnership means in the broader context of our lives. What do you mean? I mean, we've created this incredible professional relationship and personal friendship, but we've never acknowledged how unusual and special that is. Most people don't get the chance to transform a painful situation into something so positive. She was right. In our focus on the work itself, we'd perhaps undervalued the human story of how 2 women had chosen collaboration over conflict, growth over resentment, and mutual support over competition. Are you suggesting we should be more intentional about sharing that story? I'm suggesting we should be more intentional about understanding what we've accomplished, for our own sake as much as for other people's. We've proven that it's possible to rewrite relationships, to choose who you become instead of being limited by who you've been. That conversation led to our decision to co-author a book that would combine our professional insights with the personal story of how our partnership had developed. The project required us to revisit some painful memories and examine our individual growth with unusual honesty. Writing about the affair and the divorce is harder than I expected, I told Natalie as we worked on the early chapters. Not because it's still painful, but because I have to remember who I was before I learned how to turn difficulties into opportunities. I know what you mean. I have to write about being the kind of person who would sleep with a married man, which forces me to confront how naive and selfish I was. But you also have to write about becoming the kind of person who would dedicate her career to helping others heal from trauma. That transformation is what makes the story worth telling. The book, titled Transformational Partnership: How Crisis Became Collaboration, was published 3 years later and became a surprise bestseller. It resonated with readers who had experienced betrayal, professional setbacks, or major life transitions, and it sparked conversations about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of redefining relationships. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other women who had been affected by infidelity, both those who had been betrayed and those who had been involved in affairs. We received hundreds of letters from readers who shared their own stories of learning to move beyond resentment toward understanding and growth. Your book helped me realize that I didn't have to stay angry forever, wrote one woman whose husband had left her for a colleague. I'm not saying I want to be friends with the other woman, but I don't want to waste any more energy hating her either. Another letter came from a young woman who had been involved in an affair with her boss. Reading about Natalie's journey helped me understand that I can acknowledge the harm I caused without letting guilt define my entire future. I'm working on becoming someone I can be proud of. These responses reinforced our belief that personal transformation was possible for anyone willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination and consistent growth. Our story had value not because it was unique, but because it demonstrated universal principles about human potential and the power of authentic collaboration. 10 years after our first awkward coffee shop meeting, Natalie and I were invited to deliver the keynote address at the American Association of Museums annual conference. The theme was Innovation in Cultural Leadership, and we were asked to speak about how unconventional partnerships could drive institutional change. Standing together on the stage in front of 2,000 museum professionals, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who had been dismissed as just a wife was now recognized as a leader in her field, The young woman who had been defined by her mistakes had become an expert in helping others transform their own difficulties into sources of strength. Transformational partnership isn't about finding someone who complements your strengths, I told the audience. It's about finding someone who challenges you to develop strengths you didn't know you had. And it's about choosing to define your relationships by what you create together, Natalie added, rather than by the circumstances that brought you together. Our presentation concluded with a standing ovation, but what moved me most was seeing Emma in the audience, now a practicing art therapist who was developing her own innovative approaches to family healing. She had learned from watching our partnership that it was possible to transform any situation if you were willing to focus on growth rather than grievance. After the conference, the three of us had dinner together, reflecting on how much had changed since the divorce papers arrived on that Tuesday morning so many years earlier. "I have a confession," Emma said as we shared dessert. "When you first told me you were thinking about hiring Natalie, I thought you'd lost your mind." "What changed your opinion?" Natalie asked. "Watching you both become happier and more confident as your partnership developed. You brought out each other's best qualities in ways I'd never seen before." "What do you think we brought out in each other?" I asked, genuinely curious about Emma's perspective. "Mom, you helped Natalie understand that intelligence and ambition could be channeled into meaningful work instead of just personal advancement. And Natalie helped you remember that you were brilliant and capable of creating something important." Her analysis was remarkably perceptive. Emma had watched our partnership evolve from the beginning, and she understood better than anyone how we'd influenced each other's development. "But more than that," Emma continued, "you both proved that people can choose to grow instead of just reacting. You could have spent years being angry at each other, but you chose to build something positive instead." As we walked back to our hotel that evening, Natalie and I reflected on how our story might continue evolving. We were both in our 40s now, established professionals with national reputations and meaningful work. The Institute was thriving, our individual careers were flourishing, and our partnership had become a model for collaborative leadership in the arts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said no when I called asking for a job?" Natalie asked. "All the time," I admitted. "I think we both would have been fine eventually, but we might never have discovered what we were capable of creating together." "I don't think I would have been fine," Natalie said quietly. "I think I would have spent years trying to prove I wasn't the kind of person who would break up a marriage, instead of focusing on becoming the kind of person who could help others heal. And I think I would have rebuilt my career successfully, but I might never have learned how to trust collaboration or how to transform painful experiences into sources of strength." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts about the path not taken and gratitude for the path we'd chosen instead. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Natalie said as we reached the hotel. "What?" "That we proved it's possible to choose who you become instead of being limited by who you've been. Every day, we get to wake up and decide whether to be defined by our worst moments or by our commitment to growth." She was right. Our partnership had become proof that transformation was always possible, that relationships could be redefined by conscious choice, and that the most meaningful success came from helping others discover their own potential for growth. The woman who had been left for her husband's assistant had hired that same assistant and helped her become a respected leader in her field. The assistant who had nearly destroyed a family had dedicated her career to helping others heal from trauma and rebuild their lives. Together, we had proven that the most powerful response to betrayal wasn't revenge. It was the creation of something beautiful and meaningful that could serve others. And in doing so, we had discovered that the most lasting form of happiness came not from defeating those who had hurt us, but from transforming ourselves into people capable of turning any difficulty into an opportunity for growth. 15 years after our partnership began, we faced our most challenging project yet. The Smithsonian Institution had approached us to create a permanent exhibition about reconciliation and forgiveness in American history, a massive undertaking that would examine how individuals and communities had transformed conflict into collaboration across centuries of social change. "This is unprecedented," Natalie said as we reviewed the initial proposal in our shared office at the Institute. "They want us to address everything from post-Civil War reconstruction to civil rights reconciliation to contemporary immigration stories." I studied the scope of what they were asking. The exhibition would occupy an entire wing of the National Museum of American History, and would become the first permanent installation dedicated specifically to the theme of transformational relationships in American society. The timeline alone is ambitious, I noted. 3 years of research and development, interviews with hundreds of individuals and families, collaboration with communities across the country. Are you concerned about taking this on? I'm concerned about whether we can do justice to such complex historical and contemporary stories. Reconciliation is deeply personal, and it's also politically charged. We'd be walking into some of the most sensitive conversations in American culture. The project would require us to explore how relationships had been rebuilt after slavery, how Japanese-American families had navigated post-internment healing, how former enemies in various conflicts had learned to work together, and how contemporary communities were addressing issues of racial justice, economic inequality, and cultural division. But isn't this exactly what we've been preparing for? Natalie asked. Everything we've learned about personal transformation and collaborative healing has been leading toward understanding these larger patterns. She was right. Our work with individual communities had taught us about the universal principles underlying reconciliation, but we'd never had the opportunity to examine those principles at the scale of national history. That evening, I called Emma, now Dr. Emma Ashford, who had established her own practice specializing in family trauma recovery. At 28, she had become one of the leading voices in her field, frequently consulting with other therapists about complex cases involving betrayal and forgiveness. "This sounds incredible, Mom," she said when I described the Smithsonian Project, "but also incredibly challenging. How do you approach reconciliation when the harm was systemic rather than personal?" That's exactly what we need to figure out. The principles might be the same, but the application at a societal level is something we've never attempted. Have you considered bringing in other collaborators? This seems too big for just you and Natalie to handle alone. Emma's suggestion sparked an idea that would ultimately reshape our approach to the project. Instead of trying to be the sole authorities on such a vast topic, we could create a collaborative framework that included historians, community leaders, psychologists, and individuals with lived experience of various forms of reconciliation. What if we approach this the same way we've approached our community exhibitions? I suggested to Natalie the next day. Instead of being the experts who interpret other people's stories, we become the facilitators who help people tell their own stories. A collaborative curation model on a national scale, Natalie mused. That could work, but it would require a completely different kind of project management than we've ever attempted. Over the following months, we developed a framework for what we called distributed storytelling, a methodology that would allow communities across the country to contribute their own narratives of reconciliation while maintaining thematic coherence across the entire exhibition. Our first pilot project was with a rural Alabama community where Black and white families had spent decades working together to address the legacy of segregation and economic inequality. The collaboration had begun in the 1980s when a group of farmers, both Black and white, had joined forces to resist corporate agricultural development that threatened their land. "It wasn't about forgetting what happened," explained James Williams, a Black farmer whose grandfather had been forced off his land during the 1920s. "It was about deciding that working together served our children's future better than staying angry served our past." His white neighbor, Mary Patterson, whose family had bought some of that disputed land, had spent years researching the history and eventually helped establish a community fund to provide reparations to displaced families. "I couldn't change what my family had done," Mary told us, "but I could choose what my family would do going forward." Their story became a model for how individual acknowledgement of harm could evolve into collective action for healing. The community had not only addressed historical grievances, but had created ongoing structures for shared decision-making and mutual support. Working with communities like this reinforced our understanding that reconciliation wasn't a single event but an ongoing process requiring sustained commitment from all parties involved. The most successful examples combined honest acknowledgement of harm with concrete actions to address continuing effects and prevent future damage. "The key insight," Natalie observed after we'd spent a week documenting the Alabama community's story, "is that reconciliation serves the future, not the past. People choose to forgive and collaborate because it creates better possibilities for their children and their community. But it only works when the harm is genuinely acknowledged and the relationships are restructured to prevent repetition," I added. Reconciliation without accountability is just denial. These insights informed our approach to more complex historical cases. We spent months interviewing Japanese American families about their experiences during and after internment, learning how some communities had rebuilt relationships with neighbors who had supported their imprisonment, while others had been unable to bridge that divide. Forgiveness was possible when people demonstrated that they understood what they had done wrong, explained Dr. Helen Tanaka, whose family had lost their farm during internment. But forgiveness wasn't possible when people expected us to just get over it, without any acknowledgement of the harm or effort to make amends. Dr. Tanaka's family had eventually rebuilt relationships with some of their former neighbors, but only after those neighbors had spent years learning about the internment experience and advocating for reparations and official recognition of the injustice. My father always said that reconciliation required two kinds of courage, Dr. Tanaka continued, the courage to forgive and the courage to change. Both sides had to be willing to become different people than they had been. This framework, reconciliation requiring both forgiveness and change, became central to our exhibition design. We created interactive elements that allowed visitors to explore the difference between reconciliation that addressed root causes and reconciliation that simply asked victims to move past their pain. The most challenging aspect of the project involved contemporary stories of racial justice and police reform. We worked with communities that had experienced police violence and were attempting to rebuild trust through dialogue, policy changes, and community oversight. This is where our model gets tested, Natalie said, as we prepared to spend time in Minneapolis, working with families and community leaders who were navigating the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the complex process of police reform. How do you facilitate reconciliation when the harm is ongoing and systemic? The conversations we had in Minneapolis were among the most difficult of our careers. We met with family members of people killed by police, with police officers who were committed to reform, with community activists, and with city officials trying to rebuild trust across deep divides. Reconciliation might not be the right word for what we need, said Reverend Angela Davis, a community leader who had been organizing police accountability efforts for decades. What we need is transformation. We need relationships and systems that have never existed before, not a return to some previous state. Her insight forced us to refine our understanding of reconciliation to include cases where the goal wasn't restoring previous relationships, but creating entirely new forms of interaction based on justice and mutual respect. Some situations require reconciliation, I said to Natalie as we processed these conversations. Others require what we might call transformational justice, creating new relationships that have never existed before. And the exhibition needs to show both models, helping visitors understand when each approach is appropriate. Working on the Smithsonian project deepened our appreciation for the complexity of large-scale social healing, while reinforcing our belief in the possibility of transformation. Every community we studied had found ways to move beyond cycles of harm and resentment, though the specific approaches varied dramatically based on historical context and cultural values. 2 years into the research phase, we received news that would add personal significance to our professional work. Richard was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease at age 58. The diagnosis was devastating for Emma, who had maintained a complicated but loving relationship with her father despite her disappointment in his choices. "I know this is strange," Emma said when she called to tell us about Richard's condition, "but I keep thinking about reconciliation and what it means when someone can't remember the things they need to apologize for." Richard's illness raised profound questions about forgiveness, accountability, and the nature of relationships when one person could no longer participate fully in the process of healing. Emma found herself grieving not just her father's declining health, but also the conversations they would never have about his choices and their impact on the family. "Do you want to see him?" Natalie asked me when Emma suggested that a visit might be meaningful for all of us. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I don't feel angry anymore, but I'm not sure what seeing him would accomplish either. Maybe it's not about accomplishing anything specific. Maybe it's about acknowledging that he was part of your story, even the parts that were painful." We decided to visit Richard together, along with Emma. The man we found was dramatically changed from the confident attorney who had left our marriage 15 years earlier. The disease had softened his edges, leaving him confused but not unkind. "Victoria," he said when he saw me, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I'm so glad you're here. I've been wanting to tell you something." I sat down next to him, unsure what to expect. "I think I made some mistakes," he continued, his voice carrying the uncertainty that had become characteristic of his condition. "I can't remember exactly what they were, but I have this feeling that I hurt you somehow. I'm sorry about that." The apology was both meaningful and heartbreaking. Richard couldn't remember the specific details of his choices, but some part of him understood that he had caused pain and wanted to make amends. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, taking his hand. "It means a lot to me." "Are you happy now?" he asked with the directness that sometimes came with his condition. "Yes, I'm happy now." "Good, you deserve to be happy." After we left the care facility, the three of us sat in the parking lot, processing the emotional complexity of the visit. "I didn't expect him to apologize," Emma said quietly, "even if he can't remember why." "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind forgets," Natalie observed. "Maybe forgiveness is possible even when understanding isn't complete." The visit influenced our work on the Smithsonian exhibition, adding nuance to our exploration of how reconciliation happens when circumstances are imperfect or incomplete. We developed a section about healing that occurs despite limitations, whether due to death, illness, or other factors that prevent full resolution. The exhibition, titled Becoming Whole: Stories of Reconciliation in American Life, opened 3 years later to unprecedented attendance and critical acclaim. Visitors moved through spaces that told stories of personal, community, and societal healing, learning about the various pathways people had found toward transformational relationships. The centerpiece was an interactive installation where visitors could explore their own experiences with forgiveness and reconciliation, guided by questions developed from our research into what conditions made healing possible. The installation collected anonymous responses that became part of an ongoing research project about contemporary attitudes toward forgiveness and justice. "What you've created here is more than an exhibition," said Dr. Lonnie Bunch, the secretary of the Smithsonian. "You've created a framework for understanding how societies heal themselves. This will influence how we think about reconciliation for generations." The exhibition's impact extended far beyond the museum walls. Schools began using our materials to teach conflict resolution. Community organizations adapted our reconciliation frameworks for their own healing processes. International peace-building organizations requested consultation on applying our insights to post-conflict societies. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from visitors who shared how the exhibition had influenced their own relationships. We received thousands of letters from people who had been inspired to attempt reconciliation with family members, former friends, or community members. "Your exhibition helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what my brother did," wrote one visitor. "It was about choosing to build a different kind of relationship going forward. We've been estranged for 10 years, but I'm ready to try again." These responses reminded us that our work was ultimately about individual transformation as much as institutional change. Every person who learned to approach conflict differently would influence their family, their workplace, and their community in ways that could ripple outward for generations. On the 5th anniversary of the exhibition's opening, Natalie and I were invited to deliver the closing keynote at an international conference on reconciliation and peace-building in Geneva. The audience included diplomats, activists, scholars, and practitioners from around the world who were working on various forms of societal healing. "Reconciliation isn't a destination," I told the assembly. "It's a practice that requires daily recommitment to choosing collaboration over conflict, growth over grievance, and understanding over righteousness." "And it's contagious," Natalie added. "When people experience authentic reconciliation, they become advocates for transformational relationships in every aspect of their lives." After our presentation, we were approached by representatives from the United Nations who asked if we would consider consulting on post-conflict reconciliation processes in countries emerging from civil war. The opportunity was both humbling and daunting, applying our insights about personal and community healing to situations involving genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other forms of systematic violence. "This feels like the natural evolution of our work," Natalie said as we discussed the UN opportunity. Everything we've learned about transformation and collaboration has been preparing us for challenges at this scale. But are we ready for work where the stakes are literally life and death? I don't think anyone is ever ready for that kind of responsibility, she replied. But our experience has taught us that transformation is possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Maybe that's exactly what post-conflict societies need to hear. As we prepared for this next phase of our partnership, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had been devastated by her husband's betrayal had become an international expert on reconciliation. The young woman who had nearly destroyed a family had dedicated her career to helping societies heal from collective trauma. Emma, now 35 and the mother of 2 young children, had established a family therapy practice that specialized in helping families recover from various forms of betrayal and rebuild trust. She often brought our grandchildren to visit the institute, and I loved watching them play in the same spaces where we'd developed programs that had influenced thousands of people. "Mom," Emma said during one of these visits, "I want you to know how proud I am of what you and Natalie have built together." "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything to me. But I'm not just proud of your professional success, I'm proud of who you became. You could have spent 15 years being bitter about Dad's choices, but instead you used that experience to help other people heal. You turned your pain into your purpose." Her words captured something essential about the journey Natalie and I had shared. We hadn't just rebuilt our individual lives. We had transformed our understanding of what relationships could be when they were based on mutual growth rather than mutual need. "The most important thing you taught me," Emma continued, "is that you can choose what your story means. Dad leaving wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of a completely different and better story." That evening, as Natalie and I sat in our office planning our first UN consultation, I thought about Emma's insight. Our story had indeed become something we never could have imagined when it began with a devastating phone call and an awkward confession. "Do you ever wonder what we'll be doing in another 15 years?" Natalie asked, echoing my thoughts. "I hope we'll still be learning," I replied. "I hope we'll still be helping people discover that transformation is possible, and I hope we'll still be proving that the most meaningful partnerships come from choosing to grow together rather than trying to avoid conflict. Whatever we're doing, I hope we're still doing it together." I smiled, thinking about how far we'd come from that first uncomfortable coffee shop meeting. The assistant who had threatened my marriage had become the partner who had helped me discover possibilities I'd never known existed. The woman who had left our first conversation convinced she'd ruined her life had evolved into one of the most respected voices in her field. Together, we had proven that it was possible to transform any relationship, any circumstance, any seeming ending into the beginning of something beautiful and meaningful. We had shown that the most powerful response to betrayal wasn't revenge but reconciliation, and that the most lasting form of healing came from helping others discover their own capacity for growth. The woman who had been left for her husband's assistant had hired that assistant and helped her become family. And in doing so, we had both learned that the most extraordinary stories often began with the most ordinary human failures, and the extraordinary choice to transform them into sources of wisdom, strength, and service to others. As we began preparing for our work with post-conflict societies, I knew that our greatest adventure was still ahead of us. We had learned how to help individuals, families, and communities heal. Now we would discover whether those same principles could help entire nations choose reconciliation over revenge, collaboration over conflict, and hope over hatred. The assistant had become the partner, the ending had become the beginning, and the story that had started with betrayal had become a testament to the unlimited human capacity for transformation, forgiveness, and love. As we began preparing for our work with post-conflict societies, I knew that our greatest adventure was still ahead of us. We had learned how to help individuals, families, and communities heal. Now we would discover whether those same principles could help entire nations choose reconciliation over revenge, collaboration over conflict, and hope over hatred. The assistant had become the partner, the ending had become the beginning, and the story that had started with betrayal had become a testament to the unlimited human capacity for transformation, forgiveness, and love. 20 years after Richard left me for his assistant, I understood that he had given me the greatest gift possible. The chance to discover who I truly was when I stopped trying to be who others needed me to be. Natalie and I had proven that the most beautiful relationships aren't born from perfect circumstances. They're forged by people who choose to create something meaningful from whatever life gives them. He thought taking his assistant would leave me with nothing. Instead, he gave me everything: a partner, a purpose, and proof that the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming extraordinary. The end.